So, what is the relationship between water, peace, and security? Of course, a lot of headlines over the years have talked about countries going to war over water or attacking each other over infrastructure or other water resources development. The reality, of course, is a lot more nuanced and is dependent a little bit on what scale we're talking about. So, first of all, let's distinguish between conflict or tensions between countries, international conflict, and within a country, intranational. Internationally, there's very little acute violence historically over water resources, but quite a lot of political tension. Generally, the pattern which emerges is that one of the countries, often the upstream country, will develop infrastructure, maybe a dam, for which there's no agreement on how to deal with the impacts. So the downstream country naturally is going to be very suspicious and very concerned, generally has been relying for decades or even millennia on an unrestricted flow or quality of the upstream water resources. Unless there's agreement in place on how to deal with the impacts of the infrastructure, tensions can really break out. And we see this currently all over the world. Ethiopia is building its Grand Renaissance dam, and downstream, Egypt is very concerned. Laos is building dams for which Vietnam has shown a certain amount of concern over the years. Dams all over the world in Central Asia and China have elicited a certain amount of concern from downstream countries. And generally, that same concern and even tension is exactly what's necessary to move to the next stage, which is negotiation and dialogue to develop an agreement on how to deal with the impacts of new water resources infrastructure, which often can take 10 or 20 or 30 years even to resolve. But those agreements, when they're in place, are often extremely resilient, even when conflicts rage over other issues. So we see existing treaties, for example, between Arabs and Israelis, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians. Everywhere we find shared waters, we find shared water agreements, which can induce dialogue, even in times of terrific tension. So that's the international setting. And what we generally look for indicators are when, as I say, somebody wants to build something and there's no agreement for how to deal with the impacts. So the rate of change in a basin will exceed the capacity, the institutional capacity, to deal with the change. Intranationally, within countries, the dynamics are similar but different. Similar in that we're still looking for rates of change that exceed the capacity, but the institutional capacities are very, very different within countries, to the point where we often find violence. There's widespread violence between tribes, between states. For example, on the Kovri River in India, sub-Saharan Africa, tribal conflicts over shifting water resources or shifting grazing patterns. Violence within countries doesn't take the same initiative to generate as an international conflict would. And so we find it's much more prevalent. So a couple of points are worth making. First of all, the same things that indicate conflict also indicate cooperation. And there's rich histories of cooperation between countries, between users, between sectors all over the world. And so the idea of looking for future hotspots, we need to be aware that the same things that drive tensions can also drive people together. Things like droughts, floods, water quality issues, as often or even more often drive people together to problem solve than they do create tensions and conflict. The other point is that the fact that water is infused in all aspects of society mean that there's a terrific opportunity to use water and its characteristics as a way to induce dialogue, as a language for talking about shared futures between countries, between users, between sectors. And so this movement of environmental peace building using shared water resources, the protection of resources, or shared sustainable development, or the fact that water within a basin impacts people across the political spectrum, from ranchers to environmentalists to tribes to urban dwellers, and brings people in a room often when other issues or resources simply don't, is useful to be able to induce dialogue, even in areas of tension. The other point I want to make about indicators is the things that you would commonly think would drive conflict, things like droughts or population growth or climate change, are not the things that we look for to look for tomorrow's hotspots. But as I say, both internationally and intranationally, we look for the relationship between the rate of change within a basin and the institutional capacity to absorb the change. When the change exceeds the capacity, that's when we find tensions and violence. The same droughts that we find in a place with no institutional capacity can drive tensions and even violence, where in another place with terrific river basin organizations and treaties, it simply wouldn't. So one thing that's worth mentioning about shared water resources and the dialogue around those water resources is often there are voices that simply aren't heard. The indigenous people, local populations often are not the elite decision makers who are making international decisions about international relations or big infrastructure. And these are precisely who often bear a disproportionate amount of the costs of these projects. And in dialogue, often there are different ways of knowing that have different legitimacy. I tend to think of water in four manifestations. So we have physical water, the water that we see, that we touch, that we can move from place to place. We have mental water, the water that we calculate. We calculate price or efficiency. We calculate the water footprint and the virtual water. But we also have emotional water, water tied to power, to history, to sovereignty, to nationality, and finally spiritual water, the water that helps us with our spiritual transcendence and transformation, recognized worldwide. And these four types of water, often in Western driven dialogues, only two receive legitimacy: the mental water, the water that we calculate, and the physical water that we can see and touch, at the expense of emotional water and spiritual water. And often the conflict is around precisely the two types of water that are not being brought into dialogue. So this is something to think about when we're thinking about water conflicts. One of the conflicts can be simply a conflict between ways of knowing. Finally, the last point I'll make is so much of our studies around what the relationship between water, peace, and security is based on history, is based on the past. And of course, anybody projecting the future has to ask the question, what about the future may look nothing at all like the past? And we're entering into, certainly in terms of information, an entirely new era with machine learning, with remote sensing, with ways of calculating quality and quantity without ever needing to be near water resources. Climate change is shifting what we think of as a stable state. Population growth, so much change is on the horizon, both for positive and negative. Just as one example, as our desalination technology gets better and better, when the price of desalinated water can be used in a cost-effective way for irrigation, suddenly the coastal access to the coast becomes the new upstream, which may shift dramatically our entire view of hydrostrategic territory and the inherent advantage of being upstream. in a natural river system. So while we're comfortable that what we say has been true thus far, we're much less comfortable about suggesting that that may be true or that necessarily will be true into the future.